In this lesson, we'll learn how to create and modify a gradient inside Illustrator. Okay, so in the previous lesson, you may have noticed that there are some gradient swatches inside our swatch panel. Now, in this lesson, let's go ahead and talk about creating and managing gradients. Now, gradients are an important part of color inside Illustrator, so it's important that you understand them and know how to create and modify them. So let me just go ahead and select this first object here on our screen. It's a rectangle, and gradients' primary location, or the primary location you're going to modify gradients and create them, is going to be in the gradient panel. Now, let me just go ahead and undock this panel here, so we can work with it. And I think the best thing for us to do is just to sort of take a tour of this panel. Now notice here we've got a gradient preview swatch here. Now if we drop this little arrow down next to that, you're going to see every swatch in our swatch panel that is a gradient represented here. So a lot of these are default gradients that come with Illustrator and come loaded into your swatch panel. Now notice here there's also a little disk button at the bottom of this dialog. We can actually save our gradient as a swatch by using this button. So an important thing to remember there. Now there's also two main types of gradients, and it's important that you understand that. Now under the type drop down menu, we're going to see each of those represented. We have radial gradients and we have linear gradients. So each one of those is going to look a little different, so we're going to actually create both here. So let's go ahead and select linear first, and notice here that based on our default color selection over here, it's actually applied a linear gradient moving from white to black. And let's just go ahead and move through some of these options in this row right here. This first option here is going to be to reverse the gradient. So we can actually flip that gradient just like so. This next option here is to control the angle of the gradient. We can actually manually input that, or we can change that based on this slider right here. So you can see here how that changes the gradient on the shape that we're working with. So let's go ahead and change that back to 50 here. Well, actually, let's change that to 0 so we can go back to where we started. Now, this next option right here is for the aspect ratio of our gradient, and that's only going to apply to a radial gradient, so we'll come back to that. So that brings us here to the gradient slider. Now, this is probably the most important part of the gradient panel. So right here that you can see that we have little color stops below the gradient slider, and we've got a little diamond in between those two color stops. These two color stops determine the color of our gradient, and you can see here by clicking on this white one, we've selected it because the little black arrow above it changes to black in color. This little diamond in between the two swatches represents the 50% mark, so that represents the halfway point between the two color stops. Now if we wanted this gradient to have more white in it, we might just drag that 50% mark a little closer to our black color stop, and you can see here that the gradient moves according to that adjustment. So and notice here also in changing the little diamond's position here, we also change the location number here. So if we move back over to right in the middle of those two, we're going to be right at 50%. So let me just go ahead and manually input 50 back into this box. Now notice this opacity slider above the location is currently grayed out. That's because we have this diamond selected. So let me go ahead and select one of the color stops, and you'll see here again we can change the location on the color slider, or the gradient slider. We can also change the opacity. So let me select this black color stop, and let's reduce the opacity of that here, making it a little more transparent. And you can see in doing that it changes the color to more of a 50% gray, but it also, if you look closely at the gradient slider, we can also see the little squares that represent transparency starting to become visible there. A little more apparent change is that there's now an underline under the black color stop. That indicates that there's been an opacity change applied to that color stop, so important for you to remember there. So let me go ahead and just bump that back up to 100%. And let's talk about creating and changing the color stops here in our gradient panel. Now, we can actually add new color stops here just by mousing over, and you can see that my cursor changes, and we add a little plus sign to it. If I click anywhere underneath our gradient slider bar, we can add a color stop. You can see here that we've added it, and it's actually taken on the color of that position in our gradient. So not only can we do that, but we can actually copy a color stop just by holding down the Alt key and dragging a copy out, just like so. We can delete a color stop, either by dragging it off of our gradient slider, just like so, or we can actually select it and use this little trash can button right here. So let's go ahead and delete that. Now let's talk for a moment about changing the colors of our gradient. So we can actually come in here and just double click on either of our color stops, and you can see here that we access a little dialog. Let me go ahead and drag the gradient panel over a little bit so none of that's off screen. We access a dialog that has both our swatch panel available to us and our color panel. So again, in this color panel, we can shift click on the color bar at the bottom to change our color model, depending on which one we're going for. Or we can come in here and select a color swatch from the swatch panel. So let me go ahead and do that now. Let's go ahead and select this light orange swatch right there. And let's come over here and let's change the color of this black one as well. We'll double click there and let's go ahead and select, let's select this deep red. Alright, so you can see we've created a new gradient based on those color changes. Let me show you another way that we can go in and make changes to our gradient. I'm going to go ahead and grab my swatches panel here, and we can also just take one of these swatches off of our panel. Maybe we want this to go to black in the center. Let's just grab this black swatch, drag it down, and release it on top of our gradient slider here. You can see we can just add a swatch to the gradient slider just like so. It's that easy. So I don't really like the look of that. Let's undo that here. And let's go ahead and talk about another tool that is a powerful tool for dealing with gradients. It's called the Gradient Annotator. And let me come over here and let's just select this ellipse down below. And the Gradient Annotator is over in your tool panel, and it looks like a little gradient swatch right here. It's also the keyboard shortcut G. It's going to access that. Now I just called this the Gradient Annotator. Actually, this is going to be the Gradient Tool. The Gradient Annotator is what's going to be activated when you're using this tool. Now let me go ahead and apply a radial gradient to our circle here. And notice here that we've applied that same gradient that we created in a radial format to this circle, and there's a little tool right here in the center of it, and there's a little dashed line around it. Now this is called the Gradient Annotator. The Gradient Annotator is going to allow you to make changes to a gradient without ever having to come to your gradient panel. It's a really a pretty cool tool. So let me come in here and show you what we can do with that. We can actually increase the size of our gradient here by clicking and dragging on this opposite end. Notice there's a large circle at one end of this, and there is a small circle here at the other end. If we mouse over this, we're going to get our gradient slider preview, exactly with the same color stops that our gradient panel has in it. We can come in and treat this gradient slider just like the gradient slider in our panel. We can come in and move the color stops. We can double click on them and access our color panel, or excuse me, our color panel and our swatches panel. Let's just deselect that here. Now this larger circle right here is going to represent the focal point of your gradient, and that's pretty important when you're dealing with a radial gradient. So that's our focal point. If we click on that and drag it around, we can actually move that focal point. Let's just undo that, or you can see we can grab this small circle next to it and we can actually slide it out and increase the size of our gradient that way as well. So let me go ahead and undo that here, and let's take a look at this little dashed line that goes around our gradient, because there's some options here and some controls on this line. Now if you can see here, if we mouse over this small control here, our cursor changes. Now we can actually increase the size of our gradient by clicking and dragging on that as well. Now if I mouse over the little dashed line, our cursor is going to change again, and it looks a little bit like the rotate command. Now we can actually rotate our gradient just by clicking and dragging with our cursor in this state. Now let me come up here and show you one other control on our gradient annotator. It's this one at the top. Now notice here we have yet a third state for our cursor. This control right here is actually going to control the aspect ratio. Now, remember that field we talked about in the gradient panel that was deactivated for a linear gradient? Watch that field now as I click and I make changes based on the aspect ratio. We can actually pinch our gradient down, just like so, and you can see the aspect ratio over here has changed. Now, let's go ahead and say that we are happy with the changes we've made to this gradient. Maybe we want to pinch it down just a little bit more and rotate it around. You know, we're happy with these changes and we want to save this as a swatch. Let's come over here now and just go to this little drop down and let's hit this little save button right here. And let's come over to our swatches panel now. If you look here, we have a new swatch with this gradient applied to it. We've now saved this gradient for use on future objects. So in this lesson, we have explored both the gradient panel and the gradient tool inside Illustrator. In the next lesson, we're going to pick up where we're leaving off here, and we're going to talk about something completely different for working with color. It's called Live Paint.